The notion that there'd be anything left seemed unimaginable at the time. Today, this new community center stands as a symbol of the extraordinary resilience of this city, the extraordinary resilience of its people, the extraordinary resilience of the entire Gulf Coast and of the United States of America. You are an example of what is possible when, in the face of tragedy and in the face of hardship, good people come together.
That was President Obama today speaking in New Orleans just 2 days before the 10th anniversary of Hurricane Katrina making landfall. Much of New Orleans still has yet to recover. A few years after the storm hit, RFL was there to see how the city was recovering and to remember how bad things were right after the storm hit.
New Orleans is more than just downtown. It's the most unique city you can think of in America. Culture, business, a vibrancy that you have to really see to get. We also learned about different parishes here, and specifically a neighborhood of the Lower Ninth Ward. The Lower Ninth Ward is indescribable until you see the pictures. But we're going to take you there now and show you what has changed. You can be your own judge if you think we've done right. I have my own opinions. It'll come out, I'm sure, during the program. But the question is, have we forgotten about many of the people who still call this home?
As the 10th anniversary of Katrina approaches, yesterday I spoke with someone who was there when it hit. Robert Mann was Governor Kathleen Blanco's communications director. Robert, it's almost hard to believe that we're 10 years now from the landfall of Hurricane Katrina. I'm sure it's difficult for you to think back that far as well. What are your thoughts today when you think back on the storm and what you saw and experienced?
When I think back, my most profound memory is the day, a couple of days after the storm, in a Black Hawk helicopter with the Louisiana National Guard and Governor Blanco flying over the city into the heart of the city for the first time, and just being stunned and overwhelmed by the water everywhere. Houses, buildings, cars, everything underwater for as far as the eye can see. It's a memory that I'll never get out of my mind as long as I live.
You've written that you've spent the last 10 years trying to forget Katrina, and I'm sorry to pry, but I'm curious as to why. What was it that was so traumatic to you that still lingers and still haunts you about the storm?
Well, you know, one thing, I certainly don't want to equate the bad memories that I have with what the people in New Orleans went through. And so I don't mean to at all say that my bad memories, my suffering is in any way equal to the suffering of people who lost everything, including family members, lost their lives, lost their homes, lost their livelihoods, are now living away from the city. But it is the memory of that time, and having so many friends, knowing so many people who lost so much. I now teach at LSU, and I had students who lost family members. A student of mine right now just wrote a piece in the Washington Post about losing his mother in the flood, and it was just an awful time for our state, for our people. We celebrate the recovery, we celebrate the rebirth of New Orleans, but you know, it was a tough time for everybody. And I think people in New Orleans, even today, there are a lot of people who aren't really enjoying this 10th anniversary. They're ready for it to be over.
You were the communications director for Governor Blanco during the storm. All eyes were on you, were on your boss, the governor, as well as a few others. But it's not like you had all the information that people needed to know or wanted to know at your disposal. How confusing, how difficult was it behind the scenes, even for folks like you who we all assumed were in the know?
Yeah, you know, when you're in the eye of the storm, figuratively, people assume you know more than you do, and really the rumors are just sort of flowing into you. You're hearing a lot from a lot of different sources. And I think it's the same lesson that a lot of journalists have to learn maybe the hard way, and that is take a deep breath, don't overreact, don't treat everything you hear as fact. And we made some mistakes. We treated some rumors as fact that we shouldn't have, and but for the most part, I learned pretty quickly to count to 10 and try to confirm especially before speaking about it in public.
How much of what you and the governor learned were you learning from the media at the time? I mean, it's not like you've got direct access to everybody in the state all at once.
Yeah, you know, a lot of what we were learning about what was going in New Orleans was from the media, because the communications between Baton Rouge and New Orleans, about only 80 miles down the road, were completely broken The communications infrastructure in the city was shattered. There was no cell phone. There was certainly no landlines. And so in many ways, the only way we were getting information was through watching the television reports and the radio coverage that we could get. That's how we were learning what was going on in the early days and hours of after the storm passed.
You know, it's amazing. 10 years later, people are still trying to figure out who dropped the ball. I mean, that's one of the conversations that happens a lot. Your former boss, Governor Blanco, usually gets a little scrutiny in that regard. Certainly former President Bush does. You also wrote about Michael Brown, who was the director of FEMA. You wrote that he was a pretentious blowhard. What did you mean by that? What did you see out of Michael Brown that was so disconcerting?
Well, I wrote in the piece that from the first time I met him the night before the storm when he met with the governor, he impressed me as someone who was really more concerned about his position. And I don't know, I had a feeling about the guy that he wasn't genuine, that he wasn't real. He just seemed like someone pretending to be important. And it turns out, I was right. I don't consider myself a particularly intuitive person about other people. It was just, I think he just gave off such an odor of an aroma of pretentious self-importance that it was hard to miss.
How is New Orleans doing 10 years later, and how prepared are both New Orleans and the state for the next big storm, which everybody says is a matter of when, not if?
Well, I think New Orleans is better protected. The levees are better. I don't think they're probably as good as they ought to be. I mean, they're not impervious to the worst possible storm, but they're a whole lot better than they were. I think the people of the region are better prepared to get out of town. I think it's going to be easier to evacuate. I don't think the state and the city get enough credit for evacuating as many people as they did in a short period of time before the storm. But I think people are much more aware of the hazards of staying than they were before. But there are still lots of problems, and most of them relate to just the rebuilding of the city. There's a lot of blighted areas. The crime is still sky high. Murder rate is out the roof. New Orleans is still in the process of recovering. People are celebrating its resurgence, and that's good, and they should, but it's still got a lot of problems.
Finally, Robert, we can't go back and make the storm change paths, but if you could go back 10 years and change one thing that either the state did in its response or its preparedness, or really any of the players did in either before or during or after, what would you change?
I think one thing that everybody would say they would change is they would have taken more seriously, and there would have been a better way for the officials in Baton Rouge to communicate with the mayor and the other officials in New Orleans. There was just no way to do that. And maybe carrier pigeon would have been an improvement. But there has to be a way for the president and the governor of Louisiana to communicate effectively in real time with the officials on the ground in New Orleans or in any other place in the state that is undergoing that kind of catastrophe. And there wasn't at the time, and I'm not privy to what communication infrastructure is now in place, but I certainly hope it's better than it was then.
Robert Mann, former communications director for then Louisiana Governor Kathleen Blanco during Hurricane Katrina 10 years ago. Robert, thanks very much for a few minutes.
Thank you.
We'll get a check of your Hudson Valley headlines after a quick break.